corporate social responsibility and creating shared value. Kyle has worked with the world's leading companies in industry, including Shell, Pfizer, Merck, Abbott Lab, and Petro-Canada, and has advised heads of states in Africa as an international development professional with Monitor Group and On the Frontier. Our second guest is Bill Reeves, President of the Integrative Design Collaborative, a consulting organization working to integrate green building design fully with living systems. He is a principal of the regenerative planning firm Regenesis and the strategic environmental planning firm Integrative Design. He currently serves on the board of the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association, as an advisor to environmental building use, and on the board of CityLab. He's a proponent of private sector involvement in sustainability. Our third panelist is Mark van Ameringen, Executive Director of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN. Mark has spent most of his career in Africa managing and implementing innovative programs ranging from public sector reform to small enterprise. He has played an important role in assisting countries in Southern Africa with their reconstruction and development. He held various senior positions in Canada for International Development Research Centre and other organizations, and worked as a special advisor to the G8 Summit on Africa's development. Last but not least, our moderator is Harvard Kennedy School's very own Len Pritchett, Professor of International Development and Faculty Chair of International Development Master's Program. As a renowned economist, Professor Pritchett has worked in international development, both in the field and in academia, for over 25 years. He has consulted governments as well as private organizations. He's a zealous debater that describes himself as an exterminator more than a moderator. So we are especially glad he has taken up this challenging task of moderating for us this morning. As you see, we have a very exciting panel in front of us. So please join me in thanking our panelists and our moderator for being here with us on this Saturday morning.
So I'll just say a very few words and then turn to the panelists. I think the issue of how the public sector and private sector interact is an extremely interesting and important issue, particularly in places where the public sector has difficulty operating effectively. Unfortunately, in many of those same situations is precisely the same situations in which the public-private interface is also the most difficult. So working productively, just going around the public sector isn't necessarily a very attractive option either. So it really is an issue of how one creates productive collaboration where it's difficult. So I will let the three panelists sort of speak to that. We'll have some back and forth amongst the panelists about different approaches and then turn to Q&A.
Well, terrific. Good morning. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here on a beautiful Saturday morning. To be here with you. I've got a question for all of you. I actually had two questions, but I just read the summary here, and I think one of the answers kind of slipped through. My first question was going to be, how many nonprofits are based in the U.S.? And there's kind of an allusion to this in the summary. It's about 1.5 million. So 50% side. Here's the other interesting question. Throw out answers. What are the revenues of those 1.5 million nonprofits? Anybody have any idea of combined revenues of nonprofits headquartered in the U.S.? Anything?
In terms of trillions?
What's that?
In terms of trillions?
Revenues per year. So what they take in, right? What they take in revenues, what they're spending. So
But in terms of trillions or not trillions?
yes, that's fine. Yes. It's 1.5 trillion. 1.5 trillion dollars. It amazes me. I think the 1.5 million nonprofits didn't amaze me so much with the revenues. That's massive. It really poses a question for all of us who care about the social sector and about solving tough problems, which is, my God, there has been just a clique of organizations targeted at, you name it, problems over the last 50 years. And look at the money that we're spending. I guess the question you have to ask is, are we solving problems at that same rate? I think the answer to that is no. So I think that the title of this session, The Future Collaboration in International Development Beyond Islands of Excellence, is an excellent one. Because what we see really is many of these organizations are operating as islands. Are operating as islands. And really, I think the way to solve a lot of these problems is through collective impact. So what I want to do very, very quickly is share with you a concept called collective impact. It's something that my firm and my colleagues have written about. We actually now have 2 articles out. If you're interested, I can make those articles available to you all. But we're getting just amazing, resonance on this concept of collective impact, and we're actually helping to solve some tough problems, things like substance abuse in Staten Island, in New York, to New York juvenile justice, to the education system in Seattle. And I'm just starting a project in Minnesota. It's targeting diabetes, using this concept of collective impact. It really starts here. And we, as a firm, FSG, we've been involved, deeply immersed in a lot of social sector issues, tough problems here in the U.S. and around the world for the last 12 years. And what we've seen is that probably the reason why we have so many organizations, but still the level of problems and ever increasing social problems, is that really the social sector tends to treat problems either in a simple way, like baking a cake, where there's a recipe, and that you need to follow that recipe. If you give me the money as a nonprofit, I will spend it, we'll do this, we'll solve the problem. Or as a complicated problem, like sending a rocket to the moon, where there is a formula. Could be complicated. This could be surgery as well, where as long as you follow a certain protocol, then you will solve that issue. But in reality, most of the problems that are out there, whether it's diabetes, economic development, issues with water, you name it, education in particular, are complex. They're like raising a child. I've got a 7-year-old. There's no manual on how to raise my boy. I can read articles about how do you raise children, but not about my boy in particular. I have to be very, very adaptive. I have to experiment, and I have to bring in a lot of people to help me raise that child. So really this is, kind of thinking about problems more in a complex way. And as I've said, traditional approaches to solving some of the toughest problems really haven't worked. And we've watched this. We have a great opportunity as we work with many foundations, large and small, and we sort of watch the behavior of funders. And it often works like this, where a funder will meet somebody, will come across an issue, and will be compelled by an individual or by an individual organization, and feel that that particular organization is the silver bullet. I mean, if you even think about it, for example, on CNN has the heroes, which is marvelous, very noble. But really, what happens is you tend to get isolated impact from this kind of notion that an individual organization operating in a complex situation can solve a problem. It's very difficult to scale. You're often disconnected from other sources of funding and partnership. So really what we look at is we imagine a different world around collective impact where there's more interaction among organizations. There's cross-sector alignment. Often government is really the institution at the end of the day that has the scale. The private sector has a very, very important role to play. And coordination needs to happen. So we are often then brought in to help against the problems I mentioned earlier on some of these issues of collective impact. And what's interesting is that, if you're thinking, wow, is he just sort of, sitting there telling me about, partnerships? Because collaboration and public-private partnerships, that's been around for 15 years. It's talked about all the time. What we're talking about is a different level of rigor and discipline around partnership. And there's many different types. There's funder collaboratives, there's multi-stakeholder initiatives, there's all types of networks out there. But as we have examined them, what we've seen is various conditions that are missing. And we're often brought in, and it's fascinating to come in, for example, to Minnesota, where you have some of the greatest assets funding and players involved in diabetes, but they came and said, we just have not solved this problem. And they realized that they are resource rich, but systems poor. So what we try to do through collective impact is bring about these 5 conditions. And I'm not going to go through them in detail. Sorry about that. But you can see here these 5 conditions, and we really feel like these are critical. And there's a whole level of knowledge around each one. The common agenda, which is when you bring the associated organizations around the table, like Strive has done in Cincinnati around education, is there a consensus about the problem and the best way to solve it? Is there shared measurement? This is often missing. So we see organizations coming together, they're talking, they meet every 2 months, but there's not shared measurement against the common agenda. In other words, there's not a list of indicators. And I have no idea what my role is against those indicators to move them ahead. Strive, this organization I mentioned in Cincinnati, which has dramatically improved the education context in that city after decades, frankly, of decay, they have seen significant improvement across about 45 different indicators of education because they're working with after-school programs, the university, community colleges, you name it. Mutually reinforcing activities. This is where there's a true division of labor against the particular problem. Continuous communication, and then the important backbone, which is often very, very difficult to create. And I think we're going to get into this in the question session, that funders find it difficult, frankly, to fund a backbone, which is really kind of the quarterback to these types of collective impact efforts. It's more compelling, frankly, to fund the one particular organization that says, I have the silver bullet. We find the backbone that actually can coordinate these activities, can actually do the research, bring the data, provide the information on shared measurement is critical if you're actually wanting to advance these initiatives. I'm not going to go into detail about some of the examples. Again, we've got articles that we've written about this, but I'll just mention one in just about 30 seconds, and that's our work with Mars, which is the candy company. Right, Mars, the candy company, M&M's, and it's a very interesting story. They are probably the largest, if not the largest, consumer purchaser of cocoa in the world. There's only a few places where cocoa is grown at scale. The Ivory Coast is one of those places. And what they've seen over the last 20 years is really a decline, significant decline in productivity among the 300,000 or so small farmers that grow cocoa. And the price of cocoa has shot up. It's now very expensive commodity. That's detrimental to them. So they've gotten involved in this issue, but they're not getting involved by themselves. They're bringing together a whole group of players in that country, from the World Bank to the government, to lots of folks on the ground to actually bring about a collective impact approach, because they try to do it themselves and wouldn't be sufficient. So that just gives you a bit of a taste of maybe this concept of collective impact just provides a bit of a framework for today's conversation. GAIN, we have mentioned in our latest article as a great example on the international side around collective impact. So I think it's interesting we've got one here. I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Hi, my name is My name is Bill Reed, and work that we do is primarily involved with community and land development. I've entered this sector, and I'm approaching this as a non-academic. I'm an architect and a planner, primarily invested in the sustainability movement. And our question, our tagline is healing ecosystems in the human spirit, which takes us beyond the realm of the typical sustainability scenario where we're basically limiting the damage. Maybe you've all heard the expression, sustainability is just a slower way to die. And we think that's not very motivating. So we think regeneration is actually the mental model we need to hold. And what does that mean? I really appreciate what Kyle had to say. I'd like to actually pick up on a few of his points. Before I get into that, though, I want to say that our entry point into the markets that we're currently working in have been through private developers, interestingly enough. You'd think, what are at-risk private developers thinking about going into this kind of woo-woo realm? And that's where we've entered the system, through developers who wanted to take an aggressive approach to sustainability. And the premise that we open our work in is that we need to be working with wholes, W-H-O-L-E-S, and living systems, not stuff. We can do all of photovoltaic panels in the world and it's still not going to create a sustainable condition. Carbon neutrality, for instance. You all know about Easter Island, the island with the big totem heads. Easter Island went extinct, and it was also carbon neutral. Carbon neutrality is important, but is not the essential aspect of sustainability. What's essential is that we actually learn to live in a coevolutionary role. And in terms of public, private, whoever enters this marketplace really doesn't matter. We are now working on a 400,000 person new city in South Africa, the watershed restoration in Puebla, Mexico, Metro Vancouver, developing a wastewater treatment plant that actually will regenerate the health and spirit of a community. So we're seeing now entry points that come from both government and private sectors. But the common denominator in all of that work is one individual. It's one individual with will that makes the difference. In fact, I don't think it's organizations that really matter anymore. The organizations are important because they will obviously implement, but the activating force comes from the individual, not the organization in our experience. So, I have to press a button here. The success factors in this work are really discovering in these places what is meaningful to people, not just what they want. We actually never ask people what they want, we ask them how they live. And what that means is that we are actually getting to know them on their own terms, not with presupposed preconceptions. And that allows us then to reconcile, not compromise. And let me move to this one, is that all design, any problem we have, thank you. Any design can be seen as an activating force and a restraining force. And we do one of two things in our culture. We either compromise, which is a lose-lose situation, or we can reconcile. And reconcile means to harmonize, means to win-win, and that's what's required. How do we harmonize human life with the living systems that we are part of? And I want to actually, and the easiest way to do that is to stop working in pieces. And this is where I want to pick up where Kyle is going. He talked about developing his child. If I took my child and said, I'm really interested, and I actually worked with my child the same way that we work with ecosystems and communities, I would be saying, I really need to focus on the kidneys and the liver and the circulatory system and his or her eyeballs. We'd be taking little pieces and activating those, and yet we'd be missing the essential nature of that whole child. Because a whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So if I took all the organs of my child and eyeballs and hair and bracelets and put them in a pot and stirred them around, I still wouldn't get my child. So, nor do we get that when we work with communities. If we take transportation and energy and food and business and economies, those are pieces and aspects of the whole. So the way we will work with the whole, and it's just nothing new, is we work with the essence of the community, the essence of the land. And it's the same way I'm working with my child. I want to know his or her essence, because the purpose of working with a child is to develop their potential, not to make a presumed an assumption about what they should be. So it requires us to be in relationship in a new way. And the work, I believe, and our practice believes, in terms of regenerating ecosystems in the human spirit, requires us to get to know each community, each watershed as a living being, and understanding the essence of that living being. And it's in the creation of that story, because this is why we tell stories in our culture. Stories hold complex relationships. And so what we do is we work with the communities in such a way, the people of the community, to co-develop their story. And it's like holding a mirror up to them. Because what's everybody's favorite subject? me. And a community is the same way. When you can help them see who they are, there's a commonality and a grounding that is incredibly motivating. And from that point, we begin to work and find out the placement of those pieces. That we have to work with pieces in our culture. But without that context of the whole, we can actually end up with a lot of unintended consequences. So I think that's all I'm going to say. It's hopefully that'll stir the pot a little. Thank you.
Great, thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm actually going to take you through maybe more of a focused approach around a big international problem, and that's really the issue of malnutrition. GAIN was created about 10 years ago to really start to think out of the box. How can we address malnutrition? We had, models that were very much based on food aid, not sustainable. We have a kind of a whole bunch of agencies based in Rome who are pretty dysfunctional in the UN system, and we really had an anemic response to working with the private sector in dealing with this. And while this has been going on, we had this challenge where we got up to 1 billion people are considered hungry and malnourished, another billion micronutrient deficient, and this is in a context of increasing population growth. And every year, almost 3 million children dying with undernutrition as the main problem. And many of these problems are hidden, like as in this photo, you'll see the two children, these are all children 3 years old. The two children on the right-hand side are stunted, and they will never recover from that in their whole lives. And 1 in 4 children is stunted today in the world. So these are the kind of very difficult challenges that we are trying to address. And so we created a new platform, which was really a public-private platform, to try and start to look at how can we approach this problem systematically. One key piece was really building new types of partnerships, experimenting with partnership models. The second piece was really looking at how do you bring innovation into this, whether it's in products, whether it's in financing mechanisms or service delivery. And the third area is really around measuring. You really need to show impact, show results, and we need to be doing things at scale. This led us to move towards a notion of a bit of what Kyle's talked about as a backbone organization, but we earlier saw this much more as a platform where we could crowd in a number of key players from the public sector, private sector, governments, and to try and leverage resources, new models, new delivery models, and play kind of a brokerage role. And that's taken a long time to do, but I think it's shown actually to be quite effective. And I think one of the no-brainers in this is that most people don't buy their food from a government. They buy their food in the marketplace. And if you're going to address malnutrition, harnessing that marketplace, making the market work for the poor is the biggest proposition that we need to do. So this led us to experiment with a whole range of models, and really these are models, these aren't small projects, these are the average size of our programs would be about a $25 million investment. And so it's us using grant money, sometimes loan money, sometimes equity or debt, any kind of different mechanisms to leverage some big investments. And so one of those has been national food fortification systems, which is re-engineering the whole national food system, bringing together all the stakeholders to do that, sometimes making it a law mandatory to do that. Others have been bringing together donors with multinationals and civil society to take on a challenge, like in the case of the Amsterdam Initiative, which is the Dutch government, AkzoNobel, DSM, Unilever, the NGOs, and a big university to say we're going to reach 100 million people. And others are more focusing on leveraging individual companies. Some companies, a company like Unilever has products that reach 2.5 billion people. So you can actually encourage them to put good products in their mix that can have a huge impact. Others like Britannia in India They have reached all levels of the economic quintile, and so they actually improve their biscuits, put iron in them, have a big impact on anemia. So there's many examples like that. Maybe one just to show you, give you more of a sense, is a big challenge that we've dealt with in Bangladesh, where we have huge levels of undernutrition. We have a fairly dysfunctional government. We have a population that earns less than $2 a day on the whole. And so how do we start to solve the problem of undernutrition? And here, this is an interesting partnership where we've come up with our partners with a product, micronutrients in a single serving sachet that are perfect for children under 2, from 6 months to 2 years. And so a whole business model to get these products available for less than 3 cents each, and bringing together a pharmaceutical company who produces these, one of the biggest in Bangladesh, BRAC, the biggest NGO in the world actually, intellectual think tank, the University of Toronto, and GAIN, to actually come up with a model where we actually we sell this product through, on the one hand, through a pharmaceutical network, 60,000 odd points of sale, and through BRAC, which actually has about 70,000 health workers who sell them as well. So combined, we have a business model where we can roll out this product and there's a sustainability around it. Just to two more quick slides. I think the last 10 years has been experimenting with about 50 large public-private partnerships, about 30 countries, and we've raised about $400 million to do this, and really leveraging that up quite a bit. And I think one of the key things has been to measure as we go. So we spend about 8 to 10% on surveys. Are we having an impact? And I think we're seeing these things have taken a very long time, 10 years to get there. But I think we're starting to see some big impacts. And today these programs reach 530 million people. And we're seeing, our target was 1 billion, we missed it, but it was a kind of a stretch target. But we are seeing reductions in vitamin and mineral deficiencies, reductions in things like measured, like in neurotuber birth defects. The last slide is really, it's not only about measurement, it's also about learning. And it's about learning for ourselves and the sector as a whole. So we have the last few years really brought on that we have to actually be showing not only that we can deliver health effectiveness and delivery effectiveness, but we actually have to show that we're moving the whole sector to get to those goals. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Before turning to questions, let me tell 2 stories of my own, just to, I think, highlight an issue that hasn't come to the fore in this discussion of partnership so far. And then if I could ask a question of each of the panelists. So even as we speak, my house is empty because I'm moving back to India. I lived in India from 2004 to 2007. And let me just tell 2 stories about sort of, not on? Well, if you push it closer, I'll just back up. So, as I was leaving India in 2007, within a couple of weeks, we had a couple of stories that illustrate, I think, kind of a problem, which is, as my family had gone to a tourist attraction in New Delhi, and as I was waiting in the ticket queue to buy the tickets to see this tourist attraction, my wallet was stolen. Your wallet getting pickpocketed, that happens all the time. Unfortunately, in my wallet was a white card that I got from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that certified that I was there with the World Bank on diplomatic status. And to leave the country, I had to return the card. So, since I didn't have the card, that meant I had to go file a police report because I needed to have the bureaucratic paperwork to prove why I didn't have my white card before I was going to be able to leave the country. So there was this bureaucracy capable of not allowing me to leave the country because of these minute regulations. As I went with my Indian driver to the police force to file it, to the police station to file it, I was just making casual conversation, and I said, do you think there's any chance the police will recover the wallet? And he sort of looked at me strange. And then I said, you know, do you think there's any chance they could find out who stole the wallet? And again, he looked at me strange because he thought, you've been in this country for 3 years. He said, sir, they know who took the wallet. And I said, you're sure? And he says, of course. You can't possibly be a pickpocket in an attractive tourist attraction location in New Delhi unless you're paying off the police. So, of course the police know who took your wallet. They got a kickback from whoever took your wallet. They're in a business relationship with who took your wallet. The police force in India is the world's largest organized crime. That's what they do, is organized crime. And they keep it organized, and they keep it from being violent, and they keep it from spilling over to be, you know, nobody hit you over the head to take your wallet. The police make sure of that. Right? But if they can get your wallet out without you noticing, hey, right? So that was the juxtaposition of a bureaucracy detailed enough but complicated enough. And sure enough, 3 weeks later as we were leaving, my son had, through a combination of circumstances, changed passports in Singapore during the time he was in India, and had ended up trying to leave India without an entry stamp into India in his passport. So the bureaucrat at the airport was not going to let him leave the country because he didn't have an entry stamp into India. The logic that I'm clearly in India, so I came into India, and why you need proof that I came into India. Now, there was a good reason why the bureaucrat was nervous about this. 2 weeks before, a prominent member of the national legislature had been arrested while on a plane because he was earning $10,000 a trip by pretending people were his wife and child, going through the VIP route to the airplane. Not henceforth, he would go to the VIP lounge, he would send the passports to be approved without them physically seeing who he was with, and hence he was smuggling people into Canada by getting a kickback of 10,000 person smuggling. So again, completely rife with corruption, right to the highest levels. But the bureaucracy was willing to not let my son get on the plane because he didn't have the appropriate entry stamp. Okay. So, India, it's a deeper point that there are rules. The deeper point is that India is ranked in the top half of the capability and effectiveness of governments in the world. So when we talk about public-private partnerships with governments in most of the world, we're not talking about Cincinnati, we're not talking about Seattle, we're not talking about even Staten Island. We're talking about the agency which is the collaborator is often the dysfunctional, corrupt obstacle to progress rather than being a facilitator. So part of the issue with public-private partnerships in low-capability countries is how do you form a partnership with a dysfunctional entity in the first place? And are public-private partnerships as ways of getting around the dysfunctionality of the state reinforcing rather than strengthening the capability of the state? So that's kind of a generic issue that I think we should get back to, because it's one thing to talk about what one can do in Cincinnati. But let me ask 3 specific questions, which are somewhat along this line. First, as I'm looking at your slide on common agenda, shared leadership, mutual reinforcing activities, I'm reminded of a famous book called The Functions of the Executive, which was written by one of the first CEOs of AT&T, which was one of the first large modern corporations. And these 5 functions were, in fact, what it meant to be a corporation. And part of the point was, in complex activities, we have to bring them all within the corporation. And what the CEO does is ensure the corporation does it. So part of the question is, yeah, this is what needs to happen, but that's precisely why people have invented organizational forms like the corporation to bring them inside. And how effectively does this work if they actually remain outside? Meaning, you know, it's hard enough to get a corporation to have shared measurement. I mean, anybody who's worked in a large corporation realizes every unit of the corporation wants to have its own performance metrics and resists headquarters from imposing stuff on us. So how you get people that don't even agree they're in the same organization to agree on shared measurement or mutually reinforcing activities. Second question for Bill. Will I answer that one? Okay, you can answer that one too, but there are 3 questions for everybody, right? Second is community. You know, community is precisely what the contested thing is. So, not to make everything about me, but as you point out, everybody loves to talk about themselves. I'm moving out of a town called Belmont. Honest to goodness, I don't know the first names of any of the 10 people who live most proximate to me. Is that true? No. I know the first names of one of the 10 people that live most proximate to me. Am I part of the community of Belmont? What? And then, if you move to scale, Mumbai. What's the community at which Mumbai exists? You know, I can see, you know, if you live in an isolated rural town where there's 300 people, you can imagine that there's a community around which we could create a shared narrative. What's the shared narrative of Manhattan? What's the shared narrative of Boston area, right? And the world is moving towards much larger urban agglomerations and away from situations in which people know and share a narrative with their loved one. I'm sure you have. And finally, and this is partly because you use the word partnership, right? Half of all marriages end in divorce. It's kind of the most intimate partnership there is. It's a partnership that gets reinforced socially and in lots of ways, meaning there's like pleasurable activities they engage in order to reinforce the partnership. So there's benefits to the partnership, and yet half of all of those end in divorce. So partnership is a very tricky thing. What makes us think that partnership versus just let the market rip and let lots of different people do what they do on their own and let the winner take is really the way to go? Because anytime you get into a partnership, you might stifle the creative activity of other people. And when we talk about the private sector, in part the private sector works because they don't form partnerships. Whenever the private sector forms a partnership, the U.S. Department of Justice comes and says, no. We don't want the private sector to have partnerships. We want them to compete.
Should we go ahead?
Go ahead.
If I can recall the question, I guess is, how does this framework actually stack up, I guess, in the international context? I think, Mark's example is a great one. Or let me put my face. I think that, what Mark is doing with GAIN is a great example of this working, and it is very, very hard. But what we have found is organizations trying to do it on their own, and oftentimes they kind of move in this direction, but do it in a way that's just not that effective. So, indeed, these are kind of the classic kind of principles of kind of good organizational behavior. But this notion that the way to solve a problem is that we got to get everybody around the table. We're going to work together. And I'm only one part of it. is very new. I'll tell you my own story on this. And that is, I was based in Zimbabwe at the end of the 90s, 1995 to 2000. I was there for HIV prevention and family planning. This was before the government essentially kind of fell apart. And it was a big project. It was at scale. It was national funding by U.S. government, Dutch, you name it. And what's interesting is that I think this notion of collective impact was in the air. And the funders certainly tried to inspire it. I had no incentive, frankly, to move in that direction. I sort of thought I was the guy. My concept around social marketing, we social marketed condoms and voluntary counseling and testing was it. I had the vaccine, man, and I wanted all the funding to come to me. Now, we were lucky that we were able to move the needle in the right way around HIV in Zimbabwe, but I can tell you from being in the situation how powerful this would have been had we actually involved. We were certainly working with government, we were working with a few others, but I didn't look at my activity as part of a larger whole. And there certainly wasn't a backbone organization that was sort of saying, here we are on these issues. Here is condom use. Here is, proclivities to have more than one partner. And what are organizations working together to do? Because we weren't experts in many areas, working with kids in schools. That wasn't our gig. So, yeah, again, I think you can have some progress on this, but I think the power of it, again, moves beyond kind of the conventional notion that wouldn't it be nice just to have everybody around the table and talk, to really becoming a unit, and basically kind of giving up a bit of your own kind of sense that you are the problem solver. I think it's a very, very honest and mature, I think, perspective on whatever the problem is. And what's interesting is that just getting to the common agenda is probably the toughest part. And one other quick story, and it's just happened last week. It's a domestic story, but it's very powerful. And that is when we went to Minnesota, and we met with all these groups, and there are dozens of them, and there's cash, and there are people who are experts. We came in, and the thought was, what is this idea? We're doing fine. And so we asked the question, we don't really, frankly, if it's not a valuable concept, that's fine. We left at the end of the day, after we asked the question, do you have a common agenda? Do you all agree that the ways to solve this particular problem, are all of you kind of committed to the same goals? No. Do you know how well you're doing against those goals? No. On each one of these, essentially, the 75 people in the room, who are the biggest, brightest thought leaders on this, they failed. And they said that we failed on these items. And that if we had these things, we could operate in a much better way. So whether they're obvious, doesn't really matter. I think the fact is that often they're not practiced. And so that's what really we want to see happen.
Just like shared measurement. I'm doing some work on education right now. And part of the problem is, people are in different organizations in part because they don't share a common agenda. They have different views on what's important. And part of the problem is people are really adept and clever at working back from what the measurement will imply, and hence resisting the measurement that will imply what they're doing is less important. So in the schooling situation, if you say, here's what we're going to measure about the performance of schools, people who realize that their preferred agenda will not be as rewarded in the contribution to the shared measurement will either insist that shared measurement measure what they want, in which case you haven't come any closer really, or they will torpedo the whole effort from the start. So, I mean, the huge debate in the last 20 years about what is it that we're going to measure about schools in order to have a common agenda about schools, I mean, there's both legitimate differences, and frankly, people work backward from their political self-interest to what they want measured. And part of the issue is precisely that They don't want shared measurement because they realize shared measurement would put them at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis the resources they want.
We see that all the time. I mean, I think that's pretty much human nature, but you strike me as an optimist, so.
Very disarming. I have several students in the room who may...
I thought they might have gotten a chuckle about that. Tough stuff, but I think, this is really where I think you move, where you do move the needle. And, where there is that resistance, of course there's resistance. We get resistance on all these components. I should be the backbone, because that's where the cash is. You shouldn't get it. I should be. I'm smarter than you are. So why should you get the money?
No,
So-
everybody loves coordination,
Yeah.
as long as they're the coordinator.
Well, yeah. But anyway, I think that, yeah.
Let's move to Bill and community and whatever else he wants to say.
So let me start out with a framework. Belief, just follow the hand. Belief, philosophy, principles, concept, strategy, design, test, audit, evaluate. Where do we typically enter our problem-solving arena? Typically it's strategy or design. We're leaving a whole realm of miscoordination and misalignment because we haven't even gotten aligned around beliefs. And there are core aspects of belief that we find are universal. And if you can enter it at that point, you can begin to work in some level of alignment. And I know that sounds a little Pollyannish, yet we have seen massive alignment. I can't say change. None of us have been successful, I mean, come on. How are we doing, folks?
No. Can I just disagree with that factually?
Okay, sure.
I mean, factually, the last 50 years have been the best 50 years for the improvement of mankind in the history of man by an order of magnitude. There's been more progress on every objective measure of human well-being in the last 50 years than in the previous 5,000.
Fair enough.
So,
You are an optimist.
I'm a realist. I look at the data. The data says schooling's gone up, life expectancy's gone up, material well-being's gone up by more in the last 50 years than previous 5,000 combined. The world is a night and day different place than 50 years ago. The development agenda has been the most successful social movement in the history of man. I don't know why we're always beating ourselves up about lack of success. It's just not true.
In a piece, the case is granted. However, from a sustainability perspective, the indicators are going downhill mighty fast. So take your poison, I guess. And yet I am delighted with what I see. There is momentum. So just quickly, just up on what Kyle's question was addressing, I think shared measurement doesn't happen without shared meaning. And it is actually what we realized is that my practice was hitting people with a blunt instrument and saying, you must do this, because I know better. Well, it doesn't work. And so getting down and saying, I don't know better, let's figure this out together and figure out where we are is actually a very powerful beginning. Now, the point about Belmont is really well taken. Belmont isn't the problem in many respects, although it's problems in other areas. We don't go, people don't hire us, and we don't go where people don't care. And so what we're looking for are situations that are actually fairly destabilized. A collapsing watershed. We work all over Mexico, and basically people are drinking their own excrement. That's true. And so there's a wall being hit in many cities in Mexico and Central America that we are addressing, Africa for other reasons. So what we've found is that it's not a whole. There are no boundaries around a whole. You cannot bound the living system. You're living entity. Your skin, you think, is a boundary. If it was truly a boundary, you'd be dead. There'd be no transpiration, no exchange. And if it was no boundary, you'd be a puddle, equally dead. So there's this paradox of boundary, is that you're bounded and you're not bounded. And so there are nested systems. I'm an individual, I'm part of a family, I'm part of a community, I'm part of a city, I'm part of a watershed, and those are amorphous and yet bounded at the same time. So the only way that you can work with that concept, getting rid of a reductionist mind, is through essence thinking. And it's how I get to know you or you. I don't know your organs, going back to that analogy. I know you as a living entity. And that takes me to understand this entity. It's very powerful to have, because it actually is very destabilizing for people to begin to think of themselves as being part of a living organism. Now, that's very, very abstract. But if you can actually get people to see the story that they are living out in their communities, it begins to draw them together. It isn't going to happen in Belmont, but it might happen with a few people in Belmont. And by the way, Jane Jacobs, in her work in New York City in the West Village in the 1960s, talked about regenerating the spirit of a community. It doesn't matter whether you're working with an ecosystem or a concrete human-made system. There is an essence to that place that you can discover by looking at patterns, not pieces. The way we see life is through pattern. That is a fairly new concept to what the Western mind. Indigenous peoples have used it for millennia. And instead of looking at objects, we're looking at processes. Now again, this is sounding very abstract. You actually have to experience this way of working, so this is not going to land very well in terms of proof. But what we find is that we're working in Puebla, Mexico right now. An individual in the sustainability and land planning organization in the capital of that state of Mexico approached us and hired us. We thought, we're home free, the government wants this. Until we hit the bureaucrats who are in charge of construction. Not at all in their interest. And it continually drives the point home to me is that to actually work with a living system requires us not to abstract things in universal laws and principles, but is to find the principles and laws that those entities, those living entities, are working under. And very quickly we had to say, okay, we can't talk about nice healing the environment and watersheds. We actually have to talk about construction projects that have economic meaning to those bureaucrats. Very real interest. But by actually entering in on by getting to know them on their own terms, not our terms, we've actually been able to become effective in that community. And I don't know if this is a coherent answer or not, but I just want to kind of pick some points. Is this holding together at all? Okay, well then I'm done.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, first on the divorce analogy, I think it's not a bad one because I would say that the figure is much higher than 50% of these partnerships failing. I think, and I think a lot of them could be more equated with fooling around than actual, than actual marriage. And a lot of them, a lot of partners want to get in only if someone's going to pay to play kind of thing in a big way. I think
so some marriage, some fooling around, some prostitution.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think we need to be, upfront about that. But the other side is that, there has been a fundamental market failure. And despite all the progress the last 50 years, there have been a lot of part of the world that's been left behind, disproportionately to the wealth that's been created. And that's not getting better. So. And in this area around where we're looking at, food, there is no fortune to be made at the base of the pyramid in food. It's a complete fallacy. So unless you can come up with innovative partnerships that structure in subsidies, incentives, and cover a lot of the cost, it's not going to happen because a return on investment on this is less than 3% a sachet. The same company has got a whole range of products where they make 30-40% return in the marketplace. So why would they ever go into this unless someone, is going to cover a lot of the cost? And so we cover a lot of the cost, but we've also turned it into a volume play. So you get enough volume, they'll make 3%, but it's not that's the challenge we're in. And so I think it's because of this market failure and because of it's food and it's a very low return on investment, you have to do these things. Otherwise, companies will go to the top. The return on investment with the A and B top level consumers, not healthy products on the whole. Potato chips are a great product in India. You look at one of the fastest growing food markets. Same company who's doing growth in potato chips, try to get them to do a food for small children, nobody will pick it up because there's no money in it in relation to potato chips. So I think that's and so public-private partnerships in food need to be incentivized. They need to be de-risked to some extent. You need this kind of backbone role to cover a lot of the cost, or you're going to be sitting with these challenges for a very long time. I think cell phones are different. I've had this conversation with many colleagues from here. Other commodities, there is a case at the base of the pyramid. They actually have a higher return on investment. But I think food is a very different kettle of fish. I think the last point is your first comment on government. I think you're right. I mean, government is really the elephant in the room. You do a lot of these company-based partnerships, you don't need government. But if you're doing national ones that we do, you do need government. And, governments are highly dysfunctional. There is a high level of corruption. And you have to be really selective. I think if you see that level of leakage, that level of corruption, you're wasting your time. It's really, because these partnerships take 10 years to actually often really bear fruit, and so you're really looking for those leaders in government who have a long-term view, and it tends to be few, and that's one of the challenges. But I would definitely agree that these models with dysfunctional, corrupt governments are a waste of time. It's not going to bear anything, and you're going to have they may make all the right signals, and the private companies might be coming in because they want market share. It's an emerging market, but it isn't going to work over long.
Okay, why don't we throw it open, and why don't we take, say, 5 questions, and then just have the panelists address whichever the questions they want. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3. What was it? 4, 5.
Thank you. Professor Pritchard mentioned about the business. It took the example of business and partnership. So in the business, when a large company trying to go to another country in the world, sometimes if the industry is mature in those countries, then they become part of your supply chain. But if there is a market failure, corruption, or major problem in those countries, then you go with vertical integration. So question to Mark and his panelists. I love the example of Bangladesh and BRAC. Yes, they have huge malnutrition problem, but BRAC is one of the largest NGO in the world. But even in Bangladesh, there are many parts of the country, specifically southeastern part of those countries where indigenous people live. BRAC doesn't serve or barely goes there. Grameen Bank, which started in Chittagong, 50 miles from there, Grameen Bank never reached. So in those communities, there are some local NGOs trying to serve. If you focus on the BRAC, the question is how you can extend opportunities to those communities which are marginalized and even severe malnutrition, even in the standard of Bangladesh. How do you serve and reach those communities? Thank you.
No, let's take all the
All
questions.
of them?
Okay, I think let's take all the questions. Sure.
Good morning, my name
It's
is...
much easier to evade hard questions and get upset.
We'll keep the questions fairly
Sure, okay.
Surprising inflection at the end.
My name is Monica, I come from Canadian Peacekeeping, and I want to ask how do you reconcile the fine line between goodwill of helping the world develop and solving their problems the Western way? Where is the line between teaching them how to fish and giving them the fish? So if Mexico is drinking their own excrement sometimes, where are the local Mexican engineers not solving that problem? If there are the sachets that the organization brings, where is the empowerment for the local community to solve their own malnutrition problem? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Courtney. I work in a rural village in northeastern Congo, and I was really interested in what you were saying, Mr. Reed, about building a community and looking at the essence of a community. And I'm wondering how you do that on a very practical level, especially if you're working in an area that is very remote, very isolated, not necessarily open or hasn't been open in the past to interventions, but are in desperate need of it at the moment. So I guess how are you very practically approaching that finding of the essence of the community? What leaders are you going to? Who are you talking to? That's the question.
Thank you for the speech. I would like to I have a question. My question is directed to Mr. Klein. You spoke about the partnership between the government and private sector. You mentioned something about mass. How is the collaboration between the government and private and mass working? As you mentioned, the collaboration with the World Bank in trying to achieve work with the families in terms of producing the cocoa. So how is that collaboration working?
My name is Scott Allen. I'm actually here representing one of the companies who'd like to form these kinds of partnerships. But there seems to be something we keep talking around. What's the definition of sustainability? Because to us, it seems to be a paradox. We seem to mean we want to create a system that puts us out of business and somebody else takes it over. We want to give money so that we can stop giving money. From the point of view of the country we're doing the problem, I think they have a different definition of sustainability, so I'd really like to hear your thoughts on what does that mean?
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm a representative from Claremont McKenna College, and I actually have a question regarding you're talking about corruption and transparency issue in such such problem, and I think it's really interesting that Kiva, models like Kiva, provide this model of person-to-person lending, and thus kind of have have this empowerment of NGOs to do more things, have this autonomy, economic autonomy, because economic autonomy is kind of really important issue from I think it's the base of corruption, and with this economic autonomy, what do you think the future of such new model with NGOs with the empowerment of social media, this online lending, fundraising will transform the transnational cooperation, like NGO cooperate with IGOs, and NGOs cooperate with government. What do you think the future of that? Thank you so much.
Do we have to hit enough time? I didn't start on time. What time would you like to stop?
I say quarter to
1:45. Wow, we had no quarter to. Okay. Okay, great. Why don't you say whatever you want in response to the questions that were raised, and we'll take another round and go over. Why don't we start with, go the other way this time. And then we'll,
Yeah, I think on the first question about reaching...
You don't have to answer all 5 questions.
Yeah, no, it was kind of addressed to me, so... I can't jump over this one. I think it's a big issue. We have big programs with BRAC and Grameen, and they are the biggest NGO players around, but I think your issue is how do you reach the most marginalized is really tricky. I think Bangladesh isn't as bad, but I spent a lot of time this year in India really trying to grapple with, how do we reach, India has the highest rates of stunting, the highest rates of malnutrition in the world. There's more people malnourished in India than in Africa. And it really, where we ended up is actually with a big partnership with the Dalit community, the untouchables, because we actually found that, the real marginalized people have no access to the services, and unless you can actually, look at what their needs are and partner with them, the tribal groups, the Dalits, you're never going to tackle the problem. Because in India right now, for example, is putting in place a food security bill. And if it goes through with that, they'll be giving away $30 billion each year in food subsidies. It's massive. And still they have the highest rates of malnutrition. It speaks to the issue of corruption. There's a high degree of leakage. But there are real different issues for the most marginalized people. And you have to have completely different solutions. And I think most people don't spend the time to try and understand that. It's not just having BRAC extend out or having some of the big NGOs go to these communities. It's a whole different set of problems. If you're a Dalit, they have these child centers for feeding, ICDS system. Yeah, if you're a Dalit, you can't go, or if you go, they'll beat you. So those are the kind of things you have to understand. I guess I think the issue of how do you, making sure that communities are clearly involved and own these programs. I think it really depends on the nature of the program. If you are trying to re-engineer a national food system, you do need those interest groups nationally who represent communities, but often they don't exist. Every country where we are bringing together all the stakeholders, we're looking for where are the consumer groups. They don't have them, So that you have to sometimes have proxies, but at the local level, absolutely, you cannot do anything without that. And then sometimes that's hard because the issues that you see are important. You think people need nutrition, and they tell you actually they need radios. Their wants and needs aren't exactly what you think they are, and how you continuously address that. I think the last one I'll touch on is the sustainability issue is a tricky one. What is it? I think, certainly, when we began, we thought that sustainability was really around market-based sustainability. That actually we could lead programs and they could run themselves without further subsidy. I think where we got to after 10 years is a more open concept that if government or any other interest is going to subsidize some of these programs to get the outcomes we're after, that's sustainability now. So we kind of can move to, over time that it's pretty hard to have a very narrow market-based concept of sustainability in our area. And again, the government, again, it is, a lot of the things we're talking about, public good is a key part of it, and you can't escape the fact that you need the public representative in there. So sustainability, I think, has changed for us. I think on the corruption issue, we were talking about this earlier before the meeting, but the fact that we have all these online and social media services, I think it creates a huge new opportunity to tackle some of these things. I don't think they're ever going to, the online lending and other things will replace the formal state systems, but those same mechanisms are now being used to monitor online corruption. There's some colleagues of mine just launched one in South Africa where everybody can go online and say who they paid off and how much for what, and it's kind of opening up the whole thing, and it's just starting now. So I think we're going to see actually a lot of these technologies be very useful in opening up the challenge around corruption.
Okay. So there's a middle grouping of questions. I actually think I'd like to start with the definition of sustainability. Sustainability, from our perspective, is about sustaining life. So, from the most practical concept of sustaining life, we have to actually then ask what life is. That gets pretty metaphysical. But Umberto Maturana describes life as the process of becoming, or imperfect replication. So how do we allow evolution, how do we participate in an evolutionary process is actually what sustainability ultimately requires. So then the question is how do we actually participate in the living systems that we are part of? The abstraction of sustainability, frankly, is what has screwed us up, in my humble estimation. And that is that when we lead with KPIs, we're leading with assumptions. We're leading with preconceived ideas. And the real point about how we define regeneration is that you actually have to know the particular place, the particular people, the particular project, and the essence of those projects in order to reconcile them. So let's move to that essence question. What's the practical leverage? Essence, how many of you have read Steve Jobs' biography of Steve Jobs? I'm sure a few of you have. There's an interesting, this is the simplest way to get at essence. When Jobs bought Pixar, it was a struggling motion picture company. They partnered with Disney. Jeffrey Katzenberg said, I know how to make movies. They were developing the movie Toy Story. So Jeffrey Katzenberg says, it's too sweet. We have to have some angst. We have to have some negativity in there just to make it interesting to adults. And it became a superficial application of a concept. And the movie kept getting worse and worse because it just got more bleak and black because they were listening to an applied mechanistic concept. Finally, Jobs said, stop it, let's just let the guy, whoever he is, or the creative director at Pixar, let him do his work. And what he said is we need to be working from the essence of the story. And the essence of the Toy Story were about toys. So what's the essence of a toy? The essence of a toy is a toy wants to be loved. And from that essence, that movie emerged and became very powerful because it was speaking from a resonance that we all have. Everybody ever lost a toy when they were a kid and feel sad about it still? We all relate, right? It's so essential. Now, speaking to the idea of the community in the Congo or whatever, everybody has that understanding of the place they live. It doesn't matter where you are. When you get to that level of essence, there's resonance, meaning. It's the qualitative side well, that which we typically quantify. And we need both. We need numbers and we need poetry. And so the idea of working from essence is actually incredibly powerful for people who are frankly turned off and not interested in the KPIs that we as process geeks are interested in. So that's an aspect. I don't know if that helps with your question, but it's relevant no matter where you are in the world. And the question and the answer that we have from people, or the response we get from people, in Mexico, for instance, we get the response, who are these gringos coming down telling us about our town? And once we actually introduce their story to them, because we've got the story from them, it isn't our story, we are just reflecting it back to them. It's really disarming because they said, that's our story. It resonates. That's who we are. And we disappear. And that's the point. And getting to the idea of fishing, yes. By the way, we're all drinking our excrement these days, folks. The water systems I'm not picking on Mexico. I love Mexico. I work there a lot. Most of my work is actually in Mexico. So the idea of teaching people to fish is the point of sustainability. Not coming in as a gringo and saying, here's what we know how to do. We are finding how to leverage them. And the term that we use is we are resources to them. We are not facilitating them. Facilitating, facile, we're not making things easy. We're actually making things hard. We're actually asking them to go deep and deeper into who they know and who they are, to understand who they are, because the point of regenerative development and design is that first we have to develop the capacity of people to even look at the world this way, then build the capability of them to actually govern themselves and experience that and take that relationship to that living system onward after we leave. And by the way, that takes 3 years. You cannot do this work by going in and flying out. You don't have to be there all the time, but once every 4 to 6 weeks you have to keep those plates spinning, because we fall back to a reductionist worldview. The mind takes about 3 years to shift. And so the whole point about a truly sustainable program is that we can walk away and people will participate in life on their own terms and co-evolve with that system. That's getting back to the definition of sustainability. That to us is the test of a sustainable project.
I guess I'm sort of in the role here of almost wrapping up, but it's been interesting. Drinking excrement, failed marriages. I don't want to end on those notes for sure.
Don't worry,
good. You make that seem actually good. Huh? That was the best part of the conversation. I'll take on a couple of these questions very quickly. You know, regarding the Mars situation in Côte d'Ivoire, it's still very early days, and it's been very difficult. I think, you know, because of what we've been discussing here. I mean, the government of the Ivory Coast is not what you'd call a stable government at all. It hasn't been in the last 5 years. But Mars has signed an MOU with the government to provide certain resources. The government has committed itself to provide certain resources, and that includes technical extension workers to support the hundreds of thousands of small cocoa growers. We're in the process of identifying a backbone organization that can come in and help to coordinate these activities. But honestly, it's been off and on as the government has gone through no government to a government to sort of a stable government. But I think what's interesting about that example is, you know, that Mars could have taken the approach. Nestle is another example. We've worked with Nestle with their dairy farmers in Latin America. It's the same issue. This is a commodity of which they need, rather than trying to drive down the price and trying to get, you know, these commodities as cheaply as they can, which is essentially enhancing poverty. I think companies are beginning to wake up that if they want to secure supply chain to some of their key commodities, they have to invest for the longer term. That certainly governments in some cases will not do that. So they need to stimulate it, they need to bring organizations in. But I think what's interesting is that Mars could have come in and essentially locked up a certain number of those cocoa producers and said, you know, you're ours, and you're not going to grow for any other company. You're not going to grow for Nestle, who's a key competitor. We work with both companies. Imagine how tricky that is. They decided not to do that because they realized if they locked up certain suppliers, these small cocoa producers, it would be more difficult for them to actually bring on all these other assets and partners that are needed to solve that very complex problem. The World Bank, for example, might not have been interested to get involved if it was really just about Mars and just about their cocoa producers. I wanted to take on this issue about building essence in the community. And from the point that what's interesting that we see, and we're beginning to work and talk with more oil and gas and mining companies, so extractive companies, which is really interesting. You know, there is a resource race out there, and you know, countries are now opening up, whether it's copper or oil or whatever the particular commodity is. Countries that, you know, really before 15, 20 years ago, there had not been any type of extractive industry. That's changing. And companies are beginning to think about their role and responsibility as they enter into these communities, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's for mining. And what's their role in improving the prosperity of those particular communities? Now, in a lot of cases, it doesn't work very well. There's a lot of failure out there. There's a lot of, whatever you want to call it, kind of greenwashing. But we have seen, and we've had conversations with companies, where questions are being asked beyond what I would call the MOU that's signed between a government and an extractives company. In almost all cases, there are those MOUs. And essentially what has been in the past, sort of, we will give $100 million per year to this community for education, health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the emphasis has been on the inputs. The conversation is moving, I would say too slowly, but it's moving to, let's actually think about the outputs. Improved education, improved health, and what's the role of the company beyond just providing cash in doing that. And this is what's interesting, as we have conversations, they land on collective impact, which is the issue about the question you asked, the essence of what the community wants to do. And if you don't actually set up the right governance structure, the backbone organization, then you have a lot of this continued bad habit that happens. And you don't have movement actually improving anything. And you know, a company like Rio Tinto that is setting up operations in Mongolia around one of the largest copper mines in the world, and that will be a significant part of the GNP of that country, they're asking questions about what is their role, from an output side in many of these community issues beyond just giving cash. And again, it lands on many of the principles of collective impact. If you want to actually change a problem, then you have to bring in these ideas. We're almost out of time. The only thing I wanted to say regarding sustainability is I love Mark's definition of this, that, kind of this notion that sustainability, can happen in a pure market environment. We haven't seen to be the case. And I think this notion of bridging, whether it's from a foundation, from a government, to actually incentivize a company so that the company would put more of its investment to bear, I think is very interesting. So this idea of sustainability can come across kind of in a mosaic way. I think a lot of the product development partnerships that exist and that are funded by the Gates Foundation, for example, for malaria and for HIV and for TB, where they're trying to actually develop diagnostics or medicines or vaccines, that's a great example of kind of bridged sustainability. Companies are not going to step forward to develop a vaccine for malaria. It probably will not provide the revenue that's required, but if you can bridge that, if you can find out what are the incentives necessary, then potentially you can create a sustainable engine of R&D and production. So I end with that bit of more note of optimism on all this. Thank you.
I should just thank the speakers, but I'm going to say one thing, which is out of, just because the Kiva point, a lot of these peer-to-peer contact are just not just wrong, they're deeply, completely ontologically wrong. Meaning the problem of development is not a problem of people. The problem of development is a problem of systems and institutions. And yes, you can use new technologies like the internet to put you directly and you can give to that person in that country. But to think that that's any part of the actual problem of development is just completely, deeply ontologically wrong. The development is a process about societies. And the thing is, if I give money to someone in a completely dysfunctional society, yes, they're better off, they can buy more stuff. But the deep part of the development problem is about the community, the stuff you just can't buy. So if I'm living in a country with a dysfunctional police force and a dysfunctional education system and a dysfunctional system of regulating food and a dysfunctional, everything, I can buy more of what there is to buy, but I can't buy a better police force. I can't buy a better government. I can't buy necessarily better schooling. I can't buy environmental sustainability because it's a collective problem. So again, I think the notion that the private sector has created these ways around the fundamental problem because, oh, you guys have been so stupid, you haven't realized that we can just give people money like that, just completely, deeply, ontologically stupid. So I just want to be clear that it's just not part of the development agenda really at all, and it's faddish and it's popular, but it's just and just one last thing. On sustainability, I think there has to be clarity about, the sustainability of things that are public goods is through the public sector, which means people are going to collect taxes to do them. So the idea that the goal is to get the public sector money out of it and that it only counts as sustainable if no one's spending any money on it and it's just done by the private sector, again, deeply, stupidly wrong. Things that are public goods are done by the public sector in a developed country. And so why we expect Kenya to get out of doing things that Denmark and France and the United States do as part of a routine part of what government does, again, I think it's been a deeply perniciously wrong notion. That said, as a private company coming in and doing something that is not of the type that at least potentially the government could do on its own is a really huge problem. So that the universal temptation of the private sector is to gold plate. I'm going to do some CSR, I'm going to demonstrate I'm a good guy, I'm going to come in and run a clinic. Great. You're going to run a clinic at 6 times the unit costs that the government could ever absorb that clinic onto their budget. That's the kind of sustainability in terms of cost effectiveness and real scalability that I think these guys are thinking about, and I think the corporate world often gets deeply wrong. But the notion that the clinic has to be freestanding and on its own and doesn't require any ongoing subsidies is like, just, again, kind of goofy. Because after all, why would we expect Kenya to grow out of doing what France and Denmark and the United States all do as a routine part of what governments do? So you have to decide, is this something that's a private sector thing that will grow out of, or is this a core public sector function in which what we're trying to do is encourage the institutions and systems within somehow the notions of collective action to do it in a sustainable way, which means we need to worry about the costs and resources available in the society and design something that's sustainable in its context, but not sustainable in the sense that our corporate contribution goes to 0 in 3 years and you're on your own. And if it can't survive that, it's not sustainable. Again, deeply, perniciously wrong. Let me thank the panelists.
Quickly, before thanking our panelists, please note that the next session in this forum will be the development system from the inside out, which will deal with the donor and delivery tactics. And we also have a small token of gratitude for our panelists. Please join us in thanking them for this lively and insightful discussion this morning.
So